Hello, and welcome to the Unsung Cyber Heroes TV network. I'm your host, Gary Berman. Our mission is to shine the light on the people and organizations who keep us safe online while at work, home, and school, and to serve as a business-to-business networking platform for the cybersecurity and information technology community. We're here to help. We've learned that 62% of human communications is nonverbal. That's why we include a video feed, so that you have the option of seeing our guests or simply to just listen. That's also why we're called a TV network. We're all about information and sharing, business-to-business networking. Our strategic plan is to be a force multiplier by introducing people and organizations to one another and to our audience based upon the principle that a rising tide lifts all ships. We have a great panel today, including Joe Rosenbaum, a partner at Rimon Law. Among many other things, Joe is a thought leader regarding cybersecurity, data protection, rights of privacy and publicity, and he's a nationally recognized expert on media and mobile marketing. Also in entertainment law. Steve Teppler is a partner and chair of the cybersecurity and data privacy practice at Mandelbaum, Salzburg, PC. Steve and Joe will share real-life stories of cybercrime and the challenges of complying with GDPR and the patchwork of state regulations regarding data privacy and related matters. We'll begin by hearing our guests' origin stories and learn about their missions. Then we'll discuss real-life cybercrime stories, answering three questions. What happened? What were the consequences? And most importantly, what were the lessons learned for our audience? We'll discuss the best practices on how to protect and respond to the myriad of legal challenges facing large enterprises, small to medium-sized businesses as well. All of that and more on today's episode. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
How are you, Gary? Hey, Joe.
Great.
Hi, thanks, Gary. Thanks for having us.
So glad that you're with us. Joe, you were the very first person that I connected with, during my Forrest Gump journey into the digital universe. And given that we create superhero comics focused on cybersecurity, tell us your origin story.
I started out as a lawyer working for American Express. And it was a time when computers were large mainframes housed off-site with raised floors and air conditioning. There were literally no personal computers, certainly no wireless, mobile devices. And being the low man on the totem pole, or the low person on the totem pole in the legal department, they basically said, you deal with the technology and systems and communications folks because we don't want to. And so that was my introduction to technology. And as a kind of an offshoot of that, I was asked to take on the responsibility of security, which in those days included both physical security at American Express, for example, card fraud, plastic, theft of plastic, as well as counterfeiting of travelers' checks or airline ticketing stock. And that kind of migrated into, as the world became increasingly computer literate and technology driven, that naturally led to my responsibility for information security and technology, which then kind of morphed into what we today call cybersecurity. So, as you can appreciate, most large companies have lists, have confidential information, trade secrets, algorithms that drive their businesses. Coca-Cola is the classic example of a formula that's been secret for 100 years. And so the net result of that is that I had to kind of learn very quickly how to deal with cyber criminals, how to prevent risk, detect potential fraud, and react to it as promptly as we could to prevent damage to the company. That, at the time, led to my introduction to the world of data protection and privacy. And as you know, American Express being an international company, my responsibilities were international. And when I left there, after having done about 4 years in also living in Canada as an expat, my international work continued for many companies as I was in private practice. And so to this day, a large portion of my practice is devoted to rights of privacy, rights of publicity, especially in the entertainment world, and not only infringement of intellectual property rights, but cybersecurity, ransomware attacks, how to protect companies' brands and images, especially in social media platforms these days. And quite frankly, as this pandemic has unfolded, there are so many more people that are working remotely that many companies and certainly many individuals just haven't been prepared for the security risks that are attendant to working remotely. I mean, some people still have a wireless router that has admin as their login name and 000 as their password and have never changed it simply because they either don't know or don't understand the risks or don't want to be bothered.
And just to build on one of the many important things that you talked about that we'll be getting more into in just a moment is just this notion that it kind of used to be that everything was, private and until you wanted to make something public. Now everything is public and you have to fight to kind of make things private. What's up with that?
Well, I mean, it's a function of not only the environment, but also the social media platforms and capabilities. So there is a sense that we need to share information. And because the internet and social media platforms and search algorithms never forget, not only is there just a cumulative, a dossier effect, if you will, of information that just keeps getting compiled about each of us. And that includes not just information that we put or that others post about us, but remember that every time you browse, every time you go looking for things on the internet, there is a search engine that is accumulating information about you. So it's not a coincidence that if you happen to have been looking, a year ago for a trip to, from New York to San Francisco, where Steve is graciously sitting, not really, then it's not surprising that the next time you go onto your browser, whether it's Edge or Chrome or Safari or any of them, suddenly next door there'll be a pop-up ad for a trip, flights to San Francisco or tickets to a baseball game in San Francisco. That's not a coincidence. And so I think that we are in an environment today where there is so much information that's being shared that it is almost by default, whether it's mobile information or just digital online, you almost can't avoid having a cumulative effect of information about you that's being accumulated on the internet.
Well, based upon that, it seems to me like you're going to be getting some advertisements for vacations in the Bahamas or somewhere tropical based on your background.
It's quite possible.
So, Steve, let's turn to you now. We were introduced by one of my trusted advisors, Tom Brennan of Proactive Risk, great guy. And what I really love about you is you're just a great storyteller, and writer. So we might be able to, do a little matchmaking here because Joe's, one of the nation's leading experts on intellectual properties and movies and media and all that stuff. And just the other day, you sent me a script. So tell us your origin story.
Yeah, I came by this more or less through a very, very maze-like process. I was dragged into a litigation back in the 90s with my former ex-late father-in-law, I guess would be the best way to put it. And one of the last Rambo-type litigators in the District of Columbia was involved in a Fair Credit Reporting Act suit. I was one of 3 attorneys, but I was one of the first attorneys, I guess in the mid-90s, to start keeping time on a computer rather than on a timesheet.
Wow.
And because of that, I was the official timekeeper for 3 attorneys. And when the litigation settled, this was back in the days before electronic filing. So everything was done by paper. You have to basically stamp it with a time stamper and then just stick it in a box at the courthouse and you're done. And that's what we did. So we had a fairly sizable fee application, which, because the printout date was the date before the submission deadline, was hotly contested as not having been made contemporaneously. So I began to wonder, thinking about computer evidence and thinking about how mutable computer information is, it occurred to me that computer information was just something that, it exists only at our behest. It has no provenance. It has no real anchor into what we call, a testable reality. And so, or testable verification. And so I'd always been interested in cryptography, and I had been, as one of the first users of pretty good privacy back in the early 90s. And I came up with a system and method of associating time from a trusted time source in a very strong manner with content, so that you could rely on the time that information was either created, sent, received, modified, deleted, what have you. And I have the scars of a startup to show for it, very happily so. It's really kind of interesting. I now teach information security at the University of South Florida. But what happened is that this was all about the digital evidence. And I was thinking about litigation and admissibility and all the stuff that lawyers worry about when they try to get evidence introduced into trial. And what I found out in the mid to late 90s was that everybody was worried about not what to do with it, but how to get it. And so the only place in the known universe for lawyers that I knew there was any kind of discussion was the American Bar Association's Information Security Committee. And I joined that committee. I wound up realizing that the principles involving electronic discovery, collection, identification, authentication, preservation, were all conflated with information security principles. And so that brought me into the information security world. I'm now the current co-chair of the Information Security Committee of the ABA, which is comprised of technologists, consultants, and lawyers. It's really a pretty lively group. And that pretty much gave me my intro into cybersecurity. And what I do now is I exist on both sides of the V. If you're looking at litigation, I've engaged in major data breach litigation on the plaintiff side, and I also advise clients on how to avoid me on the defense side. And since there are very creative ways in which enterprises can be caught up in the litigation net, I can basically tell people how I would approach a lawsuit against them, and how creative I could get in terms of where I could tag them for negligence, unfair business practice, perhaps even a public nuisance if there's a government involved. And so that's pretty much what I do. I help my clients out when they get hit with ransomware attacks. We're dealing with a new type of ransomware now, which is hybrid, which not only locks up your data, but sucks it out first. And your threat actors now take 2 bites of the apple. They want your money, they want your Bitcoin to get your data back, and then they want more in order not to disclose the information, which, as anybody who's dealt with an extortionist knows, is a never-ending marriage.
We created a character called Wilbur WannaCry, based upon the WannaCry, ransomware attack that kind of went wild, a couple of years ago. Can you share with our audience a real life story of ransomware? You can blind it if you have to, and kind of,
Sure.
what happened, what were the consequences, and most importantly, what were the lessons learned?
This is actually a good poster child for that. We represent a managed service provider. And a managed service provider is it's a company or an enterprise that provides technology services to many other companies or individuals, whether it's storage or platform or infrastructure. It really doesn't matter. And so what will happen is that this one managed service provider will have 1,000 or 2,000 separate accounts which they manage. The apparently one of the employees of this managed service provider either, I believe they clicked on a link rather than opened an attachment, which did two things. It unleashed a Trojan, which then started searching through the network of the managed service provider, and then proceeded to inject a ransomware, a variant of ransomware. I believe it was, I think it was WannaCry, and basically locked up not only their information, the managed service provider's information, but every one of his clients. Took all of his clients off. Why? Because they were managing that information on a hosted environment. And, you can look at this as a single point of attack, a single point of failure. The client actually had done the right thing, and the client had an air-gapped backup, which meant that he had a backup which was not connected to the internet and was, even though it might not have the most current information, would have allowed him to resume all of the operations quickly. And that's an important point that we can talk about later. But as it turned out, the backups that he had weren't quite all tested on a frequent basis. So for two of his most important clients, he had no backup.
Wow.
So he wound up having to call this insurance company. I oversaw the hiring of panel counsel, insurance counsel, and cyber forensics, walked them through the entire remediation process, investigated whether or not information was exfiltrated. As it turns out, some information was, so there had to be notification done to the various state authorities and to the affected individuals. What did it cost? I think this client got a bargain. He only had to pay $500,000 in Bitcoin at the time to get his information back, and considered himself lucky. These days it would cost a lot more. So the lesson learned from this was you can take care of everything. If you think you're protected, that's fine. But unless you do something to audit yourself and make sure that you are protected on a continual basis, which means policies and process and auditing and enforcement and all these things that people hate talking about, something's going to slip through the cracks, and then you'll have a situation like that happen.
Well, I mean, just to build on that, Joe, you have worked on both sides of the equation here. I'm sure you've been part of the plaintiff and then part of the defense, team. Which do you prefer as it relates to intellectual property and the kinds of things that you work on?
I'm not sure what you mean by which do I prefer. I'm usually pretty antithetical to what Stephen does, since my job is to counsel clients to avoid litigation and try to avoid, cyber attacks, whether they're ransomware or phishing or, spear phishing or, kind of verification scams or, whatever the latest scams are. I mean, as Steve probably is well aware, there was recently a ransomware attack on a major entertainment law firm, the Grubman firm here in New York. There a criminal group that had a ransomware program called Revile. Actually, not only, to Steve's point, stole over 700 gigabytes of data from their systems, wow, but threatened to release damaging documents, including some damaging the president, not only celebrities like Bruce Springsteen and Madonna and Lady Gaga and Elton John, but they demanded a $42 million ransom.
Wow.
And apparently they were successful in posting at least some snippets of contracts related to some of the firm's clients to just kind of give the firm some degree of evidence that they had it. But, one of the dangers, as Steve, I think correctly pointed out, is that, many firms think they're doing the right thing, but never test the system to make sure that it actually works under fire. You can refer to it as stress tests, you can refer to it as tiger attacks, but quite frankly, there is really no substitute for having a robust set of quote fake criminals try to attack your system on a consistent basis. And so I tell clients all the time, send out fake spear phishing emails to your employees, to your contractors, to anybody who may have access to your system. See what they do. If they don't react properly, make sure they get trained. And quite frankly, if there are holes in the system that you detect as a result of some of these attacks, plug them. I mean, I can tell you that in the early days of cybersecurity, when information security was kind of an afterthought in many organizations back in the early 90s and then even into the late 90s, chief information security officers of companies had to beg for money for security protocols. I mean, they would use me as the lawyer to try to scare the executives of the board of directors and saying, here are the liabilities, here are the consequences of being negligent. And also to Stephen's point earlier, check your insurance policy. Not every insurance policy will actually cover these kinds of things. I mean, people are actually finding out now that a lot of their insurance won't, business interruption insurance won't cover pandemics. And that's a sorry state of affairs because ultimately it's the client that ends up suffering. So, you need to kind of, cybersecurity, information security needs to be an institutionalized, embedded part of the culture, not an afterthought or not something that you kind of overlay because, you kind of look at it that way. I mean, I laughed before. I thought to myself when you asked me the question about nothing is private, there was a little article, probably goes back a number of years, saying, with all of the information that's being shared about everybody with Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all of these social media platforms, it's possible that not a single human being will be electable in the next 30 years because of everything that's been posted about them, that kind of accumulates. So,
well, either that or, the denominator would be that we somehow lower our standards, but either option is no good. So, Stephen, let me just build on something that that Joe just said about cyber insurance, because it seems like it's all about risk management, and I'm quite fortunate because our audience knows that we produce, amongst other things, the Cyber Hero Adventures, Superhero Comics, and our main sponsor is Aon. One of the largest insurance organizations in the world. And so one of the questions I have about that is, should you get cyber insurance? And if so, how do you kind of think about whether or not you should pay ransom or not?
It's a two-pronged question, the latter of which is a hard question to answer. It's not there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Should you get cyber insurance? That is the first thing I tell clients when they're starting up any kind of web-based information, e-commerce site. But even more so, something fundamental that Joe touched on a little bit earlier is that, it doesn't matter what business you're in these days. Your most valuable asset is your information, because without your information, your gasoline will turn to shellac in the tanks. Your grain will rot in the fields. You won't be able to ship anything. We're never going to go back to paper and pencil, all right? And that's just not going to happen. So if you look at information as your most valuable asset, why on earth would you not, number one, employ, commercially reasonable security, but also include that as part of your insurable assets? Because in the end, right now it's rates are going up, and rates are going up because of the proliferation of attacks that are going on, ransomware attacks. I happen to be a real, even though the technology that I helped develop is used as foundational element in blockchain and therefore in cryptocurrency, I'm a big believer that cryptocurrency is the biggest facilitator of black market activities and criminal activities in the universe. But be that as it may, number one, do you need cyber insurance? Without a doubt, yes. It is a sad day, as one of my clients just found out, that they got hit with an attack and their information was exfiltrated and turned out they had $50,000 worth of cyber insurance. It will take you at least a few $100,000 to find out what's going on in your enterprise, remediate it, and then you have all these attendant other costs. In retrospect, it's always cheap to have it. That's number one. You also have to look at what your cyber insurance will cover, and you have to look at the T's and C's, the terms and conditions. These days, insurers are becoming a little bit more careful about who they'll underwrite, because if you can't represent that you are taking the appropriate measures to protect your information infrastructure, when you file your claim because you've been attacked, the insurance company might reject that claim for any one of a number of reasons.
So is there, just on that point, is there, a checklist with, I have no idea how many items would be on it, maybe hundreds of small, steps that demonstrate, in legal parlance, reasonable care?
I am sure, well, each insurance company will be different, but many of the larger ones will actually have a checklist and ask, do you do this? Do you use SSL? Or TLS? Do you have a firewall in place? Is it a hardware-based or a software-based firewall? Do you have a disaster recovery, incident response, cybersecurity, bring your own device policy? Is it enforced? Do you apply or do you comply with any of the NIST standards for cybersecurity, any of their frameworks? If you're a HIPAA-covered entity or a business associate, you're going to have to be able to say that you comply with HIPAA's requirements, that you maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. If you're a financial institution and you're anywhere near the penumbra of New York, you have New York's law, cybersecurity law, that you'll also have to comply with. So, the checklists are out there. The insurance companies will, at the very least, provide you with a whole menu of items that you should attend to and have to respond about. So that's the long answer to a short question.
And Joe, just to build on what Stephen said about say the New York law, of course, we have the GDPR, Global Data Protection Regulations. We have the CCP. Is it R? California?
CCPA.
Yeah, CCPA. Joe, so tell us about that. Tell our audience about GDPR in a general sense, and the California, and what do we have here in the United States? Are we going to have 50 state regulations that just seems to me would be exponentially difficult to comply with, or at some point do you think there's going to be a national regulation?
Well, I mean, again, let's start with the simple question, which is, if it's a U.S.-based domestic company that only sells or markets its products or services within the U.S., then you have only 51 regulatory schemes to comply with. If you are an international company with customers or with products and services that are international, you have to worry about not only the 51, the federal and then the 50 state laws and regulations in the US, but now you have to worry about Canada and Mexico and GDPR in Europe. And, there are plenty of countries that are outside of the European Union and North America, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, pick a jurisdiction, that will have different series of laws and different series of regulations and different penalties for that. I mean, to give you a little of a brief anecdote, because to play into something Steve said, just to digress for a second, information has always been an extraordinarily important asset. And I hearken back to the days when Walter Wriston was the chairman of Citibank, and he was giving a speech at a club, and he said to the audience, he said, by a show of hands, which would you rather have, I will give you $1 million in a brown paper bag in your hands physically today when you walk out the door, or I will give you the closing prices of the New York Stock Exchange tomorrow. These were astute financial people, and not a single hand was raised for the $1 million. Every single one of them understood clearly that if you gave them the closing prices of the stock market the next day, a future prediction, you could make 2 billion times $1 million very easily. And so, and his point was that even back then, information is an extraordinarily powerful asset. Information about money, to Steve's point about blockchain and Bitcoins. So you have a regulatory framework where you have to take into account what business are you in, what products and services do you provide? Do you provide business-to-business services? So it's not only the insurance company that may have slightly different underwriting standards and risk management profiles, but you also have to ask yourself, am I manufacturing toaster ovens, or am I issuing credit cards? Am I marketing this to a base of customers who may use my product or services in New Zealand as well as in Nebraska, or are they going to be sitting it on the kitchen counter only in Ohio? And so you have such a great variety of both products, services, and jurisdictions. I tell clients point blank, take the most stringent set of regulations, privacy requirements, and apply those across your customer base, because nobody will complain if you overprotect their information. But if you screw up in one jurisdiction that has a requirement that you don't meet, you could have a huge amount of liability for failing to do that. So if, assuming you are a business that has to deal with the new privacy regulations in California, my recommendation to clients is, are you really going to try to figure out whether or not a consumer who bought a product in California and is now moving to Arizona is still subject to which protection in what jurisdiction? So just make life easier for yourself. I think we're also living in an environment, and Steve may want to weigh in on this, in which privacy, which is different from security. There's a difference between information that you want to keep private and the notion of cybersecurity. One relates to the kind of information that you want disseminated to others or that is available to others. The other is who has the right to use your information and access it on a personal basis. So if you think about it, going to the supermarket, checking out at the checkout counter and buying a container of milk, most people would be surprised if 2 weeks later they got a postcard in the mail saying, "Hi, we just saw you in the supermarket and we'd like to offer you a 20% off coupon for trying our milk instead of theirs." And they might be offended by that, but that's not a private act. You're using a credit card issued by somebody else. You're standing at a counter with a camera that's looking at you and the cashier who's checking you out. You're scanning the barcode of the milk. It's on your receipt that's being processed by who knows how many banks and credit card companies. So that's not a private act. Even people who think their passports or their credit cards are private, well, your passport was given to you by the government. They issued you the card, the number. So, the idea behind, security is to find a way to protect the assets that you have, that your company has, behind enough layers of security so that no one who is unauthorized can access or use it. Okay? It's a very difficult process. I have one client that is in the financial services industry. I can't disclose the name. They actually have almost a duplicate firewall. They have a buffer system where if a hacker gets into their system, they think that they're actually looking at real data, but they're not. They're looking at a mirror image of fake populated data that is put there to bait criminals to go after information that the company knows it's false.
Yeah, sometimes those are referred to Those are
there's a
referred to
second
as...
set of there's a second set of security protocols that actually is where the real data is behind. And there are two reasons for that. One is, a lot of unsophisticated cyber attacks take place, and they could be anything from high school students who are just being mischievous and have too much time on their hands, to fairly unsophisticated criminals, to serious criminal organizations or even governments that are looking for information. And the differentiation is that, again, it's like having 3 locks on your door when your neighbors have 2. The additional layer of security not only kind of screens out some of the hackers who might normally get through a relatively easy security system, it also buys you time. If you have a fairly sophisticated security organization, and Steve knows this as well, as I do, if you have a company that has a reasonably sophisticated security organization, they will have tools in place that will monitor and detect attempted intrusions into the system. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a buffer, you now are buying yourself time to make sure that your inner systems are secure, in addition to also throwing off a lot. So, and there are a lot of ways to do this. I mean, I'm just giving you one example, but clearly, the whole issue of security has heightened awareness in this world where more and more employees are working from home. They're using their own devices. They are using remote or wireless devices that can be kind of penetrated through wireless interception. So, this is not something that is going to go away. On the contrary, I think this is going to actually get more attention. And I think that cybersecurity is going to be much more of an issue, which is why, by the way, Gary, that the educational process that the Cyber Hero Adventures are trying to do, not only B2B, but with the educational aspect of it, is extraordinary. I mean, people should think cybersecurity the same way that they think of washing their hands or putting on a mask in the current pandemic. It should be almost an automatic response.
Wow, that's a great overview. And Steve, let me just switch to something. And boy, I could just listen to you.
Let me follow up with something Joe said, because it's really important. I'll keep this short. In the old days, you bought the product and you own the product. If the product was given to you free, you became the product. These days, you can buy the product, you can get the product free, you're still the product. The information that you create is always going to be sought to be monetizable. And because of that, this is what heightens privacy issues. Privacy is policy-driven more than security-driven, and is really a subset of cybersecurity, as Joe mentioned. And it is probably, it's a generational perspective thing. There are people I know who really don't care what gets put out on the internet about them, and there are other people who are just extremely sensitive about it. When it comes to intellectual property, that becomes a grave concern of most enterprises, because if you have a trade secret, it gets exposed, it's no longer a secret, and your enterprise is threatened. So,
just to build on that, and by the way, this is fabulous. Thanks so much, gentlemen. What about, so large enterprises, will have the resources, whether it be financial or, staff and things like that, to protect themselves. What about the small to medium enterprises? Stephen, what is your view, about their level of vulnerability, and what advice would you have, for our audience for, an SME?
For small to medium enterprise, they have the same problems. It's not even a scaled problem. It's the same issue. Your threat actors are going to do their homework on you. They'll figure out how much your annual revenues are, and they will base a ransomware amount based upon what they think you can afford, which is, they do their homework. But regardless of what you do, this is, I teach my students this. You can build a house with 11 doors, and if you put a lock on 10 of them, you're not almost secure. All right? It just doesn't work that way. And so this is something that is, it's a business process that has to be built built in rather than built on.
Right.
And it's something that is just mandatory. You know, you at least some policies have some sort of backup, have some sort of plan for a disaster, have somebody who's in charge for it, have somebody who might be around if that person is climbing Mount Everest and doesn't have cell capability to respond and tell you what to do. Have a written policy so you don't have to run around like the Keystone Cops in case something happens. For small to medium enterprises, that should be done. I've known of small businesses that, you know, have backed up their information and done what they can do. In the end, are you 100% secure? No, nobody will ever be that because it's a moving target. But at least you should make as much effort as you can and expend what it is you think is worth to do that. And it's not as expensive as it used to be able to implement these measures.
Right. Well, yeah, I was gonna say the technology that has created the problem has also created cost efficiencies in securing against the problem. And so, you know, you know, the real question, Gary, that you didn't ask is, you know, small to medium-sized businesses, not the large multinational corporations, you know, can they not afford to do the security and the protocols? Because quite frankly, if you're a small business and you're hacked and you're subject to a ransomware attack, or your assets are damaged or unavailable to you and you can't run your business, is that any better for the people who are in the small business than the large corporations? And so in some cases, you know, large publicly traded companies, you know, obviously command higher ransomware attacks and there's a higher profile. But on the other hand, they are in the public markets and can much more easily sustain the damage from those kinds of attacks than a small to medium-sized business. I mean, you know, use the pandemic as an example. Okay, you know, it's not the large companies that are going to go. I mean, yes, there are some that are going to go out of business if they're in, you know, kind of markets. But quite frankly, the restaurants, you know, the local restaurants, the movie theaters, the dry cleaners, you know, the folks in the local small kind of businesses, the mom and pop shops that are closed, that are suffering. And so that's a good, you know, a good analogy to be able to look at and say, can they afford not to?
And following on that, you bring up a great point, Joe, because you know, most medical providers, most healthcare providers are small to medium businesses. They have some of the most sensitive information that people generate about themselves, their healthcare information, social security numbers, diagnostic information, all this juicy stuff that can keep making money for threat actors over and over again, aside from causing people a lot of grief. So, you know, what more doctors than I can tell you are basically, you know, why should I do this? Yes, I'm HIPAA compliant. Have you checked what your internal system does? Have you checked your service provider? There was a ransomware attack against the managed service provider for healthcare providers a few years ago that got hit by ransomware, and their approximately 1,500 of the practices were taken offline for about a week and a half. Think about the public policy issues, the healthcare issues that can happen when you can't reach your doctor. So the question that Joe raised, the question is, how can you afford not to have cyber insurance or take the appropriate measures? It's totally true.
Right. The other thing I think I'd like to mention before we end is that I think, and Stephen, you can bear me out on the statistics, but I would venture to say that a large majority of the cyber attacks, the security lapses, the risk issues that arise in most companies, the vast majority of them are because of internal failures. Employees aren't trained. I mean, I remember in the old days when I was in the legal department of a major corporation, I mean, people would tape the passwords onto their computer on little sticky notes so they wouldn't forget them. And so they would tell them to have very complicated passwords, and they would stick them on the side of the screen. You know, training you can institutionalize the system, but, for example, I tell some of my clients that have very sensitive information, require your employees to have two-factor authentication to log into a system.
Absolutely.
It just makes another layer of security that makes it much more difficult. So, there are little things that you can do to train employees or to kind of require them to implement yes, it's a little bit more difficult to have an extra lock on the door to get in, but the truth is that little bit of extra security is worth millions of dollars if you don't have it. So, those are the kinds of things that I think are important for, anyone who's listening today to understand that it's not just a technology solution, it's also a human solution, because at the end of the day, we are in control of these systems. We can decide to spend money to implement security. And so between, educating employees, training them, and kind of putting them in a situation where they don't have to necessarily pick one technology versus the other. You may want, a phone made by one manufacturer. I may want a different one or a different computer. It doesn't really matter, because today the access is through the cloud and through the systems, and it doesn't matter what device you have. You can still implement robust security.
Well, on that note, thanks so much to you, Joe, and Stephen, for this incredible interview. To learn more, we'll have contact information for both the gentlemen in the show notes. If you'd like to be a guest on our show, please send an email to Gary@cyberheroescomics.com, and we hope this helps. Thank you.